Thank you very much. It's a real privilege for me to be talking at a TED conference. I came in yesterday just to share with you the story of Virunga's rangers. It's a very simple story, and it may seem surprising to be telling it at a TED conference, but I think it's pertinent and important to talk about in this day when we're facing incredible environmental challenges, the achievements of those who work and live and die on the margins of the incredible achievements in technology, entertainment, and design that are being developed today, those who have not had access to that and yet are still able to confront the major problems of today. Many haven't heard of Virunga National Park. It's not as well known as some of the great parks of Africa, like the Serengeti, the Okavango, Kruger. But Virunga truly is one of the great wilderness areas of Africa, possibly of the world. As a national park, it's essentially the backbone of the Albertine Rift, and because of that, it contains within it the greatest diversity of species for a protected area in Africa, and possibly in the world. There is no protected area in Africa that has more species of birds, reptiles, or mammals than Virunga National Park. And it also has an incredible diversity of landscapes. It goes from the heights of the Ruwenzoris, the Mountains of the Moon, some of the highest mountains in Africa. And it also offers a glimpse right into the center of the Earth, with the largest lava lake on Earth. But of course, its most famous residents, the mountain gorillas, which draws the world's attention to Virunga. And it's partly because it's such an exceptional species. It draws so much emotion out of us because the mountain gorillas are our close relatives, but also because it holds the future of the national park. If we look across the border to Rwanda, a remarkable country, we see incredible achievements that center around this species, this incredible species of the mountain gorillas. Last year, the International Tourism Office registered a contribution of $430 million to the GDP of Rwanda from the tourism sector. That tourism sector only exists in Rwanda because of the mountain gorillas. So it's much more than an emotive issue. It's an issue of economics, and it's an issue of survival and development. And in Virunga, what we have is the care of an exceptional range of species. The hippos, for instance, which were once the most important population of hippos in the world. 20% of all the world's hippos were in Virunga National Park. In the late 70s, there were 27,000 hippos around Lake Edward in the park. When we did the aerial survey in 2005, there were 350 left. And because of that, the hippo has been put on the red list because of what happened in Virunga. But also all the other species, the birds, 720 species, and all those lesser-known species that are no less important. But the success of our work in Virunga National Park will always rest on its mountain gorillas, and that's what we'll be judged by as conservationists. And so that's why in July 2007, when we heard from our camp that was in the mountains, in the Mikeno sector, in the gorilla sector of the park, the very distinctive sound of AK-47 rounds being shot deep inside the forest. That terrible foreboding feeling came on us, and we immediately sent a patrol to assess what had happened. And what we found changed my life and changed the life of all the people who were with us that day, including the person who took these photos, Brent Sturton, who took this crisis to the world stage. It changed our lives forever. What we found was a terrible scene. The Regendo group, a family of mountain gorillas that we knew well, had been attacked. The silverback, Senkwekwe, had been shot 8 times in the back. 2 of the females had been doused in petrol and set alight. It was the worst scene that we'd seen in Congo in the history of the park, and yet in Virunga National Park since the park had been created. And yet we were very familiar with the terrible scenes that have defined Congo's recent history. What this did was that it set in motion a series of events, some of which were actually very positive. The government was shaken up, the world's attention was drawn to Virunga, but we were extremely worried because it was the beginning of the end for a species. That's how it seemed at the time. It also led the government to a decision which was to nominate a foreigner as the park warden. The decision was made on the basis of the complexities of the situation, the ethnic rivalries that were so characteristic of the situation around Virunga. And as a result, I was offered the incredible privilege of leading Virunga's team of rangers, which I took in a few months later. But what I didn't realize at the time, what none of us really realized, was that an army was being trained, an army was being formed. This was the army of the renegade general Laurent Nkunda, and we were in the beginnings of what turned out to be the worst period of the civil war in eastern DRC. What happened was that, as has so often been the case in this terrible war that's characterized Congo over 15 years, a war that is now considered to be the greatest tragedy, the greatest cause of human suffering since the Second World War. It's actually a succession of conflicts, most of which have started either in or around Virunga National Park. And in October, exactly 3 years ago today, in October 2008, the war escalated, and our park headquarters in Rumangabo found itself in the no-man's land between the rebel army of Laurent Nkunda and the government forces. And so our station was destroyed, our homes were destroyed, all of our staff and their families were forced into the forest. It was a very violent attack that started at 4 o'clock in the morning, and we found ourselves in a state of desperation. All of our staff joined this movement of desperate people from the national park, from Rutshuru towards Goma, and joined the ranks of 1 million internally displaced people around Goma, around the town of Goma. It was at that point that I heard that General Nkunda had announced that he was going to form a new administration. And this meant that we were never, ever going to be able to go back to Virunga, and our rangers and their families were now in these internally displaced camps. Our funding had run out, we had no money, we had 2 cholera epidemics. Things were not looking good. And I have to say that I was lost. I didn't know what to do next. We were at the end of the road. And it was at that point, on a rainy day, a rainy November day, that I sat down with my 3 senior officers, respectively responsible for the north, the central, and the southern sector of the park. And while I was at a loss, they had lived through this before. They had had the experience of dealing with very, very difficult situations. And it was my incredible good fortune to be supported by 3 exceptional people. Norbert Mushenzi, who was a director like myself, who'd started in Virunga in 1968, had lived through all the difficulties that Virunga had known. Innocent Mburanume for the southern sector, whose father was a ranger, his grandfather was a ranger, and he was utterly committed to the park. And Rodrigue Katembo, who doesn't have a family history with the park. His early career was spent as a child soldier. He'd been forcibly recruited and trained in Rwanda. He'd fought the first Congolese Civil War. He'd walked almost 5,000 kilometers through Congo's rainforest to come back and to be told by his mother to leave the army and get a proper job. And so he joined the Park Service and re-educated himself. On his own back, he did his primary, secondary education. He got a university degree and a master's. An incredibly motivated person. And what they did was they gave me the 3 foundations on which we were going to rebuild this park. We were absolutely determined to keep things going. And I was able to rely on their experience. The first was the politics, dealing with the politics. And by that I mean dealing with people's aspirations. The second foundation was the economics, understanding people's needs. And the third, and the most important, is the humanity. Understanding that even in these incredibly difficult situations, when terrible things are happening, there's an incredible kindness in people that you can fall back on, but also an incredible determination to keep going, an incredible struggle for survival. And I think that's something that's been with us for 3 million years. It's what defines us as humans, and it's something that we can draw on that goes beyond anything else. And so we traveled. We traveled to Kinshasa. Our job was to convince the head of state to allow us, as government security officers, to enter rebel territory and to negotiate with the rebels. Amazingly, they understood. They understood the importance of World Heritage, and they understood that it goes beyond national politics. With Norbert, we crossed the front, and we met with General Nkunda and explained the importance of the park, and the importance of keeping the mountain gorillas alive, keeping this park alive. And he accepted it. And then came the biggest challenge of all, which was to convince our incredible team of rangers who had been through unbelievable suffering, so that their friends and colleagues had died, getting out of Rumangabo and walking for 10 days through the forest without water or food. And what we had to do is to convince them to go back to this place where they had suffered so much and to continue the work. We talked to them, and not a single one refused to go back. Now, I think what's important is that their salary, $30 a month, had not been paid for 3 months. You know, they weren't expecting to be paid. It was their duty, and they did it. And so we went back to Virunga. There was an important job of reconciling the Tutsi and the Hutu components within the staff. It wasn't difficult. It all happened. The park always came first. And then the job of finding out what had happened to the gorillas. And there I was again reliant on Innocent. He was the expert. He has to be the world expert on mountain gorillas. He knows each one individually. He's grown up with them. He knows them extremely well. And that wonderful moment after the war, when the silverback Humba recognized Innocent and came up to him. And there started the job of identifying and finding out how many gorillas we had. That was the fun part. The the very difficult part was dealing with all the illegal acts, in particular the destruction of the park. Charcoal being a very important aspect of that. It's a $35 million a year industry, of which most of the money goes to the armed groups. And there are three main armed groups: the FDLR in the south, responsible for the genocide in Rwanda, the Mai Mai militias in the middle of the park, and the ADF Nalu, a Ugandan militia group, all three of which have taken refuge in the national park. And so by tackling this very destructive charcoal, we were taking on these militias who were making their money from that. The same thing with the fish on the lake. There was a lot of illegal fishing. But there's also a very positive side. You know, we were going to relaunch tourism. And that meant providing security. We had to retrain the rangers and get going. The government agreed to spend 30% of all the revenue we created for the local communities. And so it made a lot of sense to relaunch tourism. And in spite of the war, in spite of the reputation that we have for insecurity, we've had 100% growth in tourism 3 years in a row. This year is the first year that we're going to exceed $1 million from tourism revenue, of which 30% goes to the local community. And this has meant that we've been able to build schools. We built 9 schools around the park, rebuild the roads, really participate in that incredibly exciting project, which is rebuilding a country after a period of war. Other countries have known that, Mozambique, Angola, and we're just getting into that phase, and it's incredibly positive, and there's absolutely no doubt that Virunga can play a very real role. But the best part of it is actually using the park to generate revenue for the community. So here we were able to get money for a hydroelectric project that we're building with the community. That's water from the park. It's water from healthy projects, from healthy forests, sorry, that flow because we're protecting those forests. A flow of water means we can generate electricity. Electricity means jobs, and that's the future of the park. Likewise, you know, we have this terrible problem with this charcoal, which is feeding the armed groups. We can attack the militias, or we can cut off their supply of funding. And so that's what we started to do with the alternative energy programs. Now there's over 1,000 people, mainly women, working on alternative energy around the park to avoid buying the very destructive charcoal in the park. But of course, the most important is security. And because of that, we've taken on the full brunt of what is involved in protecting a national park. And so 150 of our men have died since 1996, since the war started. The worst year of all has been this year. We've lost 17 rangers. Not, as one would expect, protecting the wildlife, but actually nearly all of them have been killed protecting the public on the roads that pass through the park. And I think that's an extremely important part of conservation. It's not just about protecting wildlife, it's about taking on all the responsibilities that are involved in the jurisdiction that we cover, which is a protected area. And what's terribly important here, of course, is that you know, it's the hardest job to bury the men that have been entrusted to you. But they understand the risks, and again, not a single one has refused to go back after they've buried their friends and colleagues. And so, essentially, that's what I wanted to present. I wanted to present a face of conservation, the fact that it's not always the great ideas, the great thinkers, the great leaders that make the difference. It's sometimes the most disempowered. And I think that Virunga is, you know, very much an example of that. Virunga will be a great victory for conservation. I do believe it'll become a billion-dollar industry, the tourism that goes with Virunga in the next 10 years, and that is very much their victory. And I hope that that's an idea worth spreading. Thank you very much.